Okay, let's delve into a really fascinating historical puzzle today. Where exactly did the Apostle Peter write one of his important letters? The ones in the Bible. For so long, the default answer, I think, for many of us has been Rome. That's the traditional spot for the end of his ministry. But our sources seem to hint at something else entirely, something kind of surprising. So today we're doing a deep dive into the material. We want to contrast these common ideas with, the actual historical and biblical evidence. And the first clue, the thing that really gets us started, it comes straight from 1 Peter 5.13. Peter himself says his letter was sent from Babylon. Now, that immediately raises a big question, doesn't it? Is he talking about the actual geographical place, Babylon? Or is this symbolic, a code word for Rome, maybe people have taught for ages?
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that for a very long time, the standard interpretation has been symbolic, that Babylon means Rome. This view, well, it got passed down by some pretty influential early church figures, and it just sort of stuck, became ingrained. So our mission here in this deep dive is to unpack why. Why did people start saying symbolic Babylon? And then weigh that against what we find in historical records and, crucially, the Bible itself. We'll even touch on how maybe popular culture, like that old novel Quo Vadis, might have nudged our thinking, blurring fact and fiction a bit.
Well, Quo Vadis, I remember that. So, okay, after digging through all this, what's the takeaway? Where does the evidence actually point about where Peter wrote those letters? Where do we even start unwinding this?
Well, the first thing that jumps out is how the whole idea of Peter ministering and dying in Rome seems to be largely speculation. It's not really based on immediate, solid historical accounts from the time. The evidence, the mentions of it, they only really start popping up with Clement I around AD 96. And think about that, that's nearly 20 or 30 years after Peter likely died, around AD 68. Subsequent mentions, they come even later, maybe 50 to 100 years later.
Decades later. Wow, so definitely not an eyewitness thing. More like something that developed over time looking back.
Exactly.
Yep.
Precisely. And that timing, it's really crucial because this theory, the one saying Peter was in Rome maybe as early as AD 45, well, it likely served a purpose. It helped establish and, maintain the authority of the early church, especially the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope. It provided this strong apostolic link to Rome, maybe where one didn't naturally exist in the historical record. And like you said, even things like Quo Vadis, that story of Peter fleeing Rome during Nero's persecution, then turning back, it really shaped how people imagined Peter's end, even though historians point out inaccuracies.
That's a really powerful point about how stories, even fictional ones, can take root. But let's get to the ultimate source. The Bible itself. Does it back up the idea of Peter being in Rome?
That's the critical part, and honestly, the biblical evidence largely seems to contradict it. It points away from Peter ever being in Rome. Think about the Apostle Paul. He's very clear in Romans 15.20. He says his ambition, his goal, was to preach where Christ wasn't already known. He explicitly says he didn't want to build on someone else's foundation.
Right, I remember that verse.
So that principle kind of clashes fundamentally with the idea that Peter had already established a major church or apostolic base in Rome, doesn't it? If Peter was the big figurehead in Rome, Paul saying that wouldn't make much sense.
Huh. So Paul's whole ministry approach creates a direct tension if Peter was already significant in Rome.
Yeah, that's a really insightful point. Absolutely. And there's more. Look at Peter's primary focus, mentioned in Galatians 2.7 to 8. His ministry was mainly to the circumcised, to Jewish people. That strongly suggests his work was centered more in the East, maybe Syria, Antioch, places with large Jewish populations. Not so much Rome, which was predominantly Gentile. And maybe the most compelling thing, Paul wrote a lot of letters, either from Rome or to Rome. And in all those letters, there is zero mention of Peter being there, not one.
No mention at all, even when Paul lists people.
None. Think about his very last letter to Timothy, probably written from a Roman prison. In chapter 4, verses 10-11, he says only Luke is with him. And he specifically asks for Mark to be brought to him, saying Mark is with Peter. Where? In Babylon. It's a really significant silence if Peter was supposedly leading the church right there in the same city.
Wow. Okay, so if we put all these pieces together, the late timing of the historical claims, Paul's clear mission statement, Peter's main audience being Jewish communities likely in the East, and Paul's complete silence about Peter in Rome, it seems that the consistent evidence, both biblical and historical context, points pretty strongly towards the literal geographical region of Babylon, not Rome.
Exactly. This whole deep dive, it really underlines how important it is to, carefully weigh historical traditions against what the Bible itself actually says. And it kind of leaves you with a thought, doesn't it? How do you approach information, maybe long-held beliefs, when they seem challenged by the text itself, especially when the text often seems pretty straightforward, pretty literal, unless it tells you otherwise? It's an encouragement, really, to calmly examine the Bible, read it carefully, and try to discern what it's truly saying.